Um, yeah, so I am a social scientist and you are technicians. And so we have to see if I can find a language that you can understand. And I hope so. Um, but let me first, so Erasmus is, as you said, I work there. And of course, I don't know everything about him. Actually, we just invited the one person who wrote a biography, most recent biography about him. But one of the things that he was really important was in the so-called religious wars in the 16th century, trying to sort of change the Catholic Church from within, rather than sort of the Protestants who were coming up and sort of broke with the Catholic Church. So he was a rebel of sorts, right? So and although he traveled Europe, he bought his doctorate actually in Italy, and conversed a lot with all kinds of powerful people. He was in his life, he was sort of trying to change the world from within. So I think that is also maybe a good connection to you, Marjan, about the kind of work that you are doing. So what I want to talk about is a little bit is we just heard Marjan's story about how important it is to try to prevent, the kind of disasters that are heading for us when we don't sort of try to lower carbon emissions and all those kinds of things. But we also know that we are not going to prevent everything, so that crisis will be upon us. And we just went through a major crisis, the COVID pandemic. We also had, in the Netherlands, but also in Germany and in Belgium, a flood of the River Maas, and smaller rivers next to that. And of course, we've experienced many other types of disasters around the world. So we also need to think about how can we prepare for, the things that will come to us. How can we sort of prepare for, well, the unknown I mentioned, because we don't know how those disasters will work out. We don't know when they will come. We don't know what kinds of effects they will have, but we are certain that they will be there. And this is actually what the Pandemic and Disaster Preparedness Center is trying to do. So we've built a consortium of researchers from TU Delft, from Erasmus MC, the medical center here in town, and from Erasmus University, to try and think about, okay, so we know that the risk of pandemics and of flood risks will increase. So what are the kinds of effects that we will see? What are the kinds of measures that we might take? What kinds of monitoring systems we might set up, and all those kinds of things. And those will not only be pandemics, but they will also be environmental disasters like floodings. We know that there is, an increased type of risk for those types of floods, so we need to be prepared for that. And what we're trying to do is to set up a program, and actually, some programs are already working, in which we try to, do a lot of lab research, looking at, the kinds of new viruses, but also, water labs trying to sort of stimulate floodings in the Netherlands, but also elsewhere, learning from floodings that already happened. And then try to set up monitoring systems and simulation models to actually prepare, and play for the kinds of effects that might be heading for us. As a social scientist, I'm involved to look at not so much all these technical details, but more about how will society respond, and how actually will decision makers also respond, and what can we do to build a more sort of resilient response to those disasters, and especially in healthcare, how can we build more sort of resilient healthcare systems? Because as we know, and we know that, of course, we just went through the pandemic, that those kinds of events actually put healthcare systems under enormous stress. And you've probably, lived through that in your own countries. We've lived through that in the Netherlands, and of course, all, crises will have looked differently in different countries. We've all experienced that. In terms of shortages of personal protective equipment, shortages of hospital beds, shortages of people, places that were quarantined, all those kinds of things. And we've also mentioned, looking for words, sorry. We've also come to realize that our existing institutional structures often do not comply. So, for example, in the Netherlands, we have this wonderful system of testing. And the Dutch are very proud of that because it's a very sort of expert-led, slowly functioning or small-time functioning system in which we have been able to really connect, with the testing of bacteria and viruses, etc., to clinicals, to the clinic. And one of the things that have come out of that is that we've been very successful in preventing antibiotics use. So the Netherlands has, one of the lowest antibiotic use in healthcare, which is very good because it protects us against, all kinds of viruses or all kinds of bacteria, that become resistant to antibiotics. In the pandemic, in the corona pandemic, however, that system proved to be the problem that we would have to deal with because we weren't able to scale up testing capacity as other countries have been able to. So, for example, in Germany and France, testing capacity has been much. It's commercial, it's automated, it's roboticized, it's large scale, etc. We don't have that. We didn't have that. So we really had to circumvent, existing institutional structures. For example, the power of the microbiologist to really go through that to make sure that we had testing capacity. It lasted a year before we had that. So it took us a year to build up a system in which we had this testing capacity. Similar with ICU beds. The Dutch were very proud of their system of the intensive care units because we use them very sparingly. We only have like 1,000 of those beds, which is 5 times less than Germany relative to population. And we had a system in place in which people were much more taken care of in other places, so medium care, etc., and that was really well organized. But with the pandemic, we needed much more ICU beds than we had before. So, and of course, that's not only beds, because, people, so it was very interesting to see how people start counting beds. So we need more beds. But of course, you also have to have the workforce to then take care of the patients. And training people to work at an ICU takes a couple of years. So what we did is train people in 2 days. And then, of course, you saw a lot of, interesting, but also bad things happening in ICUs. So we need to become more resilient. We need to be able to cope with actually the unknown bottlenecks that we will be meeting. And not only to prepare and to monitor, etc., but also being able to bounce back from those crises. And it's clear also that needs a multidisciplinary focus. We cannot do that from a technical side, we cannot do it from a social side, we cannot do it from a medical side. We have to have the combinations of those. So what went wrong during COVID? And of course, this is sort of my analysis, and we can discuss that, and it's also a little bit probably biased towards the Netherlands. And at least if I look at the last 2 years of what our government has been doing, but also some other governments have been doing, is firstly, we failed to grasp the essential nature of the crisis. And this is uncertainty, and not uncertainty in a sort of technical sense, we need a little bit more knowledge so that we can fix things, but uncertainty on a very large scale, including not only sort of epistemic, but also political and social uncertainty. We didn't know how the public would be reacting to the kinds of measures that were taken. We didn't know how to deal with the sort of the creativity that that came up in society in trying to deal with this with the crisis. Our government approached the COVID crisis very much as a sort of logical endeavor, grounded in a very narrow kind of evidence, looking specifically at the microbiologists and the virologists. Those were the disciplines that very much influenced whatever government was doing. So we have, like any country, we have a sort of outbreak management team, and they're called differently in all countries. But those were all sort of medical specialists. There were no technicians there were no social scientists, and this was the kind of knowledge that was informing our government policies. And so government got stuck in what I would call a sort of single valuation. They valued one thing. They had one strategy, and in this case, it was preventing infections, but also protecting the healthcare system through that. And that was the single one sort of strategic goal that they had during 2 years. Right, and it never really changed, and ignoring also lots of other things. So one of the, from a social science perspective, what is very important is, of course, the growth of social inequalities. Children not going to school is bad for all children, but it's much worse for people who don't have the abilities to, to do online training, that do not have the parents that can help them in their homework, all those kinds of things. And those kinds of effects were really ignored during the 2 years of the pandemic. So, and I've seen, so one you probably also like is a paper in Nature that was recently published, and it's called "Why WHO Took 2 Years to Say COVID is Airborne." We are still talking about, hand washing and scrubbing surfaces and all those kinds of things. This is actually pretty unnecessary, as we may believe the current evidence. Because as climate scientists, and it took WHO 2 years to take that over, that actually it's much more aerosols that are important in spreading the virus. And so we need better climate control. So that's for certain. But it's also clear that our government got sort of stuck in one way of reasoning. And that was one of the major problems. Similarly, the neglect of the social sciences, again, our MP, Mark Rutte, who ignores, a lot of environmental stuff, but also likes to ignore society, saying, I'm not looking for sociological explanations after there were riots with the introduction of a curfew. So, we need to understand that if we deal with crises of the sorts of COVID or, major floodings and those kinds of things, it is not enough to think of these single-minded technical solutions, but we have to look also at the complexity and the social-technical complexity that is involved there. So we have to shift our mind from saying there is one singular scientific truth out there to saying there's actually multiple truths, and there is multiple realities that are being created in different types of sciences. And it's not that we have to establish truth in that sense, we also have to explore tensions, and we have to explore the patterns in there. We have to take this complexity, which is not just a sort of complexity out there in the world, but also a complexity in us in terms of the way that we value things, the way that we see things, the way that we act on things, and take those seriously. We have to understand that causality is not linear, but it's actually emergent and organic. And that one measure can have effects that we cannot predict. So this is also the reason why we have to monitor things. We don't need to focus on the mean, which we often do, but we have to focus on variation. COVID showed us that it's not so much, the mean value of, say, what happens with children not going to school, but it's actually the variation of and the lower side that we have to focus on. That also means that our solutions cannot be standard; they have to be flexible. We have to have governments and organizations that are apt in sort of flexible reactions. Our ethical assumptions cannot be just singular. And during COVID, we had a sort of, well, broadly you could say utilitarian, so quality and costs compared, but actually they have to be much more pluralist. Decision making cannot be centralized; it has to be distributed. It's also the decentralized systems that know a lot about what the kinds of things that are happening. So thinking differently in different ways and organizing things differently. This is one of my favorite examples. It's from Rotterdam. We just saw a picture also of that. This is actually Hofplein Square, which Arno Bonte already showed, which is going to look different in a couple of years. So I very much like the roundabout. The roundabout is one of the sort of best inventions in the safety of traffic ever done. We know that it's a system that combines mobility and safety in a very elegant way, because it makes use also of the users of that platform. They are there to sort of monitor what's going on and to sort of become part of the flow of traffic. In Rotterdam, they don't believe that. So in Rotterdam, the idea is that people cannot think by themselves, but we have to control them. So what did they do? And this is the right bottom side picture, which I took myself a couple of years ago. They put traffic lights on a self-regulating system. And of course, what then happens is that users start to, do different things. So this is actually, and my favorite is the woman there in her wheelchair, an automatic wheelchair, that just goes on through a red traffic light because she knows it's safe. And it's only the traffic people, in the offices of the municipality of Rotterdam that think that she has to act in specific ways. But people are unpredictable, and people will, make their own valuations and make their own assessments of what is safe behavior in different ways. So we have to take that into account when we think of every kind of solution that we want to come up with. Okay. So we need to be more pragmatist, and I'm not saying pragmatic, but pragmatist in the sense of the pragmatist philosophers. We need to understand that science is fallible. Look at the way that WHO acted in relation to airborne. We have to incorporate that theory is underdetermined, and that we need to take in the data, in different types of data. We have to understand that ideas and actions are inseparable. People act on the basis of what they believe the world is, not on the basis of truth, but on the basis of the definitions of reality. We need to look at problems in different ways. We must be more creative. Use epistemological pluralism, but probably also artists and other people who can imagine things in different ways than we can think of. We need to understand that the public frame issues maybe in different ways than we do, and that they will respond on the basis of those frames in different ways than you would expect them to do. So taking those user perspectives into account means that you cannot, well, I heard, for example, the word smart building, and I would hate to live in a smart building, a building that thinks for me. I want to think. So what does that even mean, a smart building? I don't even know. You have to think about the people who are inhabiting those buildings, actually. And they will also surprise you in terms of their creativity and in terms of their sort of ability to work around everything that you might come up with. So that also means that we have to build solutions with rather than for communities. And there has to be much more participatory democracies in a way, and not only on a sort of national level, but also on our local levels or in the buildings that you are making or in whatever that you are doing. So organized sort of skepticism, organized opposition, because otherwise you will come up with solutions that will probably not work. So, a couple of design principles for that. So governments must recognize the unknown unknowns during crisis, and not focus on one goal only, and be prepared to change those goals. Science advice, and that can be nationally, but it can also be very locally, must be organized such that different disciplines can give input on equal footing. So not just the microbiologists and the virologists there. They're important. We need them in terms of a pandemic. We need more water management people in times of floodings. But we also need different types of experts. And you have to create sort of platforms in which they can really institutionally be involved. Decision-making structures should be distributed. So in times of crisis, it's actually the people on the floor that know the best. I've had one of my students during the pandemic went out, to local communities in Rotterdam and talking to people there, and there was a lot of knowledge that she sort of gathered that was not represented at all within the crisis decision-making structures that the municipality had in place. And this is also the reason why lots of measures actually didn't work, because they weren't open to those types of distributed knowledge. And lastly, crisis arrangements should allow for redundancy and flexibility. So there should always be sort of systems in place that can circumvent existing institutional structures, in existing ways in which we've organized this. Okay, this is what I had to say. Thank you.